You know how when they say at conferences, this person needs no introduction, and it's a real pain because you then give an introduction. This person needs no introduction, and I'm going to give one anyway, because I am an unashamed fan of this person. In October 2006, the Australian Financial Review included him in its list of sort of the 10 most profound cultural influences in Australia. He is without doubt the most powerful political lobbyist in mental health in Australia. He has many, many accolades. He is in fact the Executive Director of the Brain and Mind Research Institute at the University of Sydney. He is, in my mind, the public face of psychiatry in this country. It's not at all surprising that in 2007 he was appointed to the Prime Minister's National Council on Drugs, and then in 2008 to the National Advisory Council on Mental Health to discuss your brain and your wellbeing. Please make welcome Professor Ian Hickie.
Should I go again? I think I'll leave after that. Thank you, Michael. You're very generous, kind. I've been asked to talk about some basic kind of brain structure issues for a change and their relationship to function, and then more or less the biology of your emotionality, and importantly, how you might learn to control that and understand that. And I'm very keen to do that, actually, to, in a sense, add some of that basic science to the wider sets of interests that we all share. And what the point of all that is, after lots of practicing to make it move, you make the slides move for me? I doubt it. Go the other way. That's unlikely. No. Now, that's much better. Let's get back to the start. If your brain's working and you're engaged and everything's going right, this is how we'd all like to look. I found this photo on a website advertising so-called nutraceuticals. You know, the things you should take, and if you took them and you bought them off the web, you'd look like this. I think the obvious thing is if you did all this stuff, you wouldn't need to take the nutraceuticals. Okay? And the basic kind of issue which I really liked about the particular website was the extent to which it shows people in physical activity, transgenerational activities, child minding, and in social relationships actually behaving in the kind of ways for which your brain's actually wired and the rest of your health is actually orientated. And it's kind of interesting the extent to which much of us have an idea about living a life like that, or an even more active life in the great Australian tradition of being really physically active in a particular way, but the extent to which we don't really understand how we might actually bring that about, and the extent to which actually doing those activities is so important to actually brain health and to maintaining, as a consequence of that, your mental health and your capacity to actually participate in life. Obviously, the sort of dominant sort of paradigm of the 21st century is of a brain that does respond and physically changes itself in relation to its social environment. And that's very different to the brain paradigms of the 20th century, which were based much more on a fixed machine kind of idea, a thing that was fixed in its elements, had the same number of neurons from the day you were born to the day you died, and basically just sort of rotted sort of progressively in the faces of the insults that life delivered you. So this kind of idea is a very optimistic one, and certainly a modern science kind of one, but one that is continuously challenged, in fact, by a notion of what is happening can be for good or bad, things that we understand in the bad sense, in illness and toxicities and things that can drive brain ill health and interfere with your capacity to live a productive life, and those things that really matter in terms of promoting brain health that actually enable you to live a more productive life. And the rather circular kind of argument between two of my personal favourites, employment and education, the extent to which you need to stay in them your whole life, never retire. And never quit education. We've got educational institutions. We want you to come your whole life and keep paying us now your whole life to get more and more education, and the extent to which they drive brain growth and actually maintain your health. The last two are very important. I don't personally like them a lot, dietary restriction and exercise, but somehow biologically, evolutionary-wise, doing more and more of those two things contributes to, in fact, brain health as you age. Very important as I go on to talk about the brain in some detail, it's not a brain in a bottle. It's not a brain actually in isolation. It's a brain that sits within a whole physiological system, which is the whole of your physical self, and the extent to which we understand now much, much more the mechanisms by which brain health and brain function regulates things like the cardiovascular system and the immune system and other aspects of your hormonal systems, and the extent to which dysfunction in those systems themselves actually drive in reverse changes in brain structure, in mood, in cognition, in social behaviour on an ongoing basis. Many of us think, and I think there's a great danger in certain kind of situations of being preoccupied with one's own internal mental life, that actually the physiology of that is sitting within a wider set of environments, some of which we understand and some which we don't understand. We understand now well in which the brain, in fact, if it's chronically distressed and unwell, puts you at risk of cardiovascular disease. If you're chronically stressed, not that you're more likely to get cancer, but if you have cancer, then it's more likely to see tumour growth in association with chronic stressful states. We understand more and more of the specifics of those situations. We also understand more and more that if you're suffering something like an infective illness, the way, in fact, that might cause you to get moody and irritable and have sleep and other sets of disturbances, or being treated for a particular illness with particular pharmaceuticals or medicines, the way in which they may have side effects that feed back and change in ways that we don't really expect or understand the nature of our physical health. It's very important from a brain point of view that makes it difficult. People don't experience their brain in the same way they experience their heart in terms of feeling a heartbeat in your chest, or in terms of the way they feel their muscles in terms of being sore or stretched, or the way they experience breathlessness if they run up a set of stairs. We have this kind of mental life that we very much experience continuously, but we often lack actually awareness of the physical thing that sits behind that. It's stuck in that rather hard casing, and we don't see its activity in nearly the same kind of way. As a consequence of that, I think people don't really often get the connection between what's happening physiologically within that thing and the way it is affecting our mood, our sleep, our capacity to concentrate, and our capacity to maintain social relationships. On a biological level, those big broad arrows I was showing in the previous slide are underpinned by more and more understanding of the hormonal elements, the immunological elements, the cytokines, the signalling elements that are operating continuously between the central nervous system and the immune system and many other systems as we unpick, or start to unpick, the way in which these things fit together. And a lot of it remains, I must say, in a very cartoonish type way. Every time we find something new, we find 10 more things. We've got no idea what they're actually doing and how exactly within the central nervous system, or in terms of the central nervous system's relationships with the rest of the body, what's actually happening. Really basic concepts in medicine and physiology, like the blood-brain barrier, an idea that brain's totally protected in order to protect it from any of the toxins in the external environment, means that it's not affected by the periphery, turn out actually not to be right. Like many things in medicine, it turns out not to be right. Today's dogma is kind of wrong tomorrow, but the extent to which it is affected in ways that we haven't understood and we'll continue to unpack as we go. What I want to retreat to now is actually within that thing. It's a pretty boring looking thing, really, isn't it? You pull it out of itself, it's just a sort of gushy, yellow, guggy sort of thing. It's the most fascinating thing, but, on a slab, on its own, it's pretty boring. It's got an evolutionary history, and importantly, it's got, if you like, 3 big components. The bit we share with all living animals, the basic brain, the bit that if you took off all the layers of the brain is at the core of it, and it's the bit that regulates the spinal cord to regulate things like heart rate and blood pressure and breathing and most of mobility, all the things we share with all of the other animals that move and do stuff on an ongoing basis. Not that interesting, but incredibly important to staying alive. On top of that, the bit that next wraps around it, known as the limbic system, or the bits that run around those basic structures, is essentially the emotional brain. Now, in evolutionary terms, you started off with the previous one, with all the other animals. As evolution has become more complex over time, the next big phase is the emotional brain. In other words, as I come to, it's considerably older than what we now see as the modern brain. This is the bit we share with most mammals, most other animals, in which we can recognise basic emotions, particularly those related to things like fear and things related to kind of social attachment, things that sort of form groups, that make animals get together, and things that make you terrified. Those really basic sets of responses. And it sits wrapped around the spinal cord and the basic brain. So emotions, without ever thinking about it, as you see in dogs and animals and any other kind of mammal you might be familiar with, when it's fearful, it does stuff. Right? And it reacts as we would react, as we ourselves react when we are immediately emotionally confronted. by fear or by happiness or by sadness or by joy, whichever emotion you want to pick, and you have a physiological response to that. You see the change in your heart rate or in sweating or in the rate that you breathe. You feel it. So when people say they feel emotions, they feel emotions. They feel the whole physiology of the brain regulating all of those other sets of factors, designed, or from an evolutionary advantage point of view, to organise the body in terms of its responses, in terms of the classic kind of fight or flight sets of responses in relation to fearful and challenging stimuli. And those limbic structures then related to fear and emotion have some pretty important sets of issues. The amygdala's the bit in the temporal lobe that sits there that recognises fear and terror. And it sits right on top of a thing called the hippocampus, which is all about memory. And it's just the most intriguing arrangement, that the most basic arrangement the brain has is between fear and memory on an ongoing basis. The amygdala also, as I'll show you later on, has a lot to do with social cognition or social processing in addition. And that sits right under the thing called the hippocampus, which goes with memory. So that's the thing that actually shrinks in dementia and Alzheimer's disease and diseases associated with loss of memory on an ongoing basis. But that's how it's set up. And if you think from an evolutionary point of view, it makes sense too. Stuff that's going to kill you, you're terrified of, you want to recognise pretty quickly and take sets of measures to avoid them. And you need to know about situations. These are things that don't require conscious thought. And they happen, in a sense, before conscious thought. They are our reactions to the world. I discuss in my clinical world a lot with people about what they believe to be the reasons that they behaved in certain kind of situations. And I often say to them, like, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that's the reason? Or did you do it? And then afterwards you tried to figure out why you did it. Because in truth, usually people's behaviour, and particularly their emotional behaviour, is instinctive, it's responsive. Now that may itself be conditioned by prior exposure, by what you remember, by what has happened to you in the past, by what is your own unique set of experiences, but it comes out pretty much directly. And then the capacity to think about it or to modulate it depends on what we recognise as the developed, particularly human, cortical brain, or the whole bits of the coverings of the new brain that we share with most of the other mammals, and certainly with the great apes, although we've got this bit at the front, the big frontal bit, the big bit shown in grey here, which is uniquely ours. Our capacity to have that frontal bit, which is one big stop button actually, is to stop doing a whole lot of stuff. It is a thing to be thoughtful about all of these other reactions and an attempt to try to modulate them as we go to change our responses in the future. But very important to realise it's the newest bit in evolutionary terms. A great advantage in many ways, but we are not without all those other bits. I often find people talk about their mental life at times as if that whole cognitive thing is totally detached from the rest of what is actually driving them. And they have a sort of unawareness of that, and often caught out by having things like panic attacks or anxiety or distress or depression. They kind of can't figure it. You know, it's not consistent with what I think about myself in some way. I'm surprised that I acted in that particular kind of situation. As distinct from this being something that actually one does need to think about often after the fact, one does need to take into account what has happened previously and the extent to which one can use it in the future to override other sets of issues. Now, brain development also has a developmental aspect. And I just want to do a little bit on how it develops over time. You don't suddenly arrive in middle life with this thing. Stuff's happened along the way. And the developmental process is quite prolonged, from basically -9 months to about 22, 23 years in most people. And some of the most important processes in the nervous system are fundamentally inhibitory. They're all about, as you grow up, learning to say stop to a whole lot of other automatic processes. One of the most important things then is the cortical brain, or the outside covering the brain, actually regulating these intrinsic or more primitive parts of the brain that lie below. And they rely on so-called cortical subcortical processes, which are going on throughout development, but continue throughout development very much in the teenage years. And those that involve the frontal cortex, really planning for the future, understanding you did a dumb thing, being able to predict what will happen next, are not mature until well into the adolescent period, an early adult period. And the degree to which they develop, this is actually from a set of slides about the effects of alcohol, can be affected by what happens. You can mess them up. They don't intrinsically go the way they're supposed to go, depending on what environmental situations you actually run into. Another key issue in terms of understanding development is to understand the way in which brain connections, not just brain cells and tracts, but the literal connections between nerve cells, or synapses, which the connections are like my fingers moving, that change all the time on the end of nerve cells in relation to everything that happens. What this particular chart shows the extent to which there's an explosion in those synapses in the first 6 or 7 years of life. Every new smell, every new experience, every new sound, every new face makes millions of synapses continuously. The first 6 or 7 years of life is just filling your brain with as many experiences as possible. And it's why, in a sense, enhanced environments in childhood are so important. And they're not just learning to read and write. The most enhanced environments are people's faces and interactions with others. They're social enhancements. It turns out there's some nasty stuff about increased physical activity and exercise too, but we'll skip over those. They're not nearly so interesting. But if you want to learn a musical instrument, you want to learn a language, but you also want to learn what we would say is just as important, social cognition, you need lots of contact with people and faces and different environments during those periods to make lots of connections, to have the experience. What happens from late childhood, early adolescence onwards is a reduction in the total number of those synapses as your brain becomes more efficient, or it prunes to make pathways or ways of behaving, which then become more progressively fixed as the set ways that you react. The brain does that from an energy point of view. If that synaptic thing kept going like this, your brain already uses about 30% of the total energy in your body, much more than most of the muscles and most of what else you're doing sitting around. It's actually your brain that's using up most activity. If it continued on that path, it would overwhelm the system. So the brain can't actually continue with that. The pruning becomes more efficient from an energy point of view, but it's also a critical period that if those pruning sets of processes are moving from being aware of every single thing to acting in more intrinsic ways, so you don't have to think about how to ride a bike. You don't have to think about how to read. You don't actually have to think about how to use the language that you've grown up with. It becomes more automatic. You can imagine in terms of social behaviour and other behaviours, they also become automatic depending on the kind of trajectories that you've been on. And so in terms of these pictures of brain development, particularly the frontal parts of the brain, which appear over there on the right in the yellow-red colours, are immature colours. The blue-greeny colours are more mature bits of the frontal lobe. So this frontal lobe bit, which is so critical to how we perceive and understand and behave in the world, is not mature in childhood. The bit down the middle in childhood, which has got to do with the motor cortex, which you see between ages 5 and 8 becoming bluer and bluer. I happen to have a young son in that age group at the moment. Don't take them on at soccer or Game Boy or DC. They will beat you. That bit they're really good at. I found I could beat him the other day in a game which required you to actually predict the future. He was so good at it. He had to wait until the thing appeared until he reacted. Then he beat me for speed. But because I knew what was coming first, because I could understand what the rules of the game intrinsically were, he was really annoyed that he couldn't beat me at that. I thought, great, I've got about 2 years here. When they get down a bit further, you can see actually there's further development of the motor cortex and association things got to do with reading and writing and understanding more complex systems. But really the frontal bit is a teenage thing. And it doesn't really get going until the mid-teenage years, and in many individuals doesn't finish, particularly in boys and young men, through into the early 20s. So that whole cognitive process and the whole brain development is still open to influences, both good and bad. And the same thing, social influences really matter. So as we move through that period, you see changes in what is happening in the grey matter, what's happening in the cortex. And at different stages of brain development, when things go awry, different sets of problems actually arise. So classically, anxiety disorders and impulse control disorders are in childhood because they are the fundamental emotions of childhood and the lack of regulation. As you move into the adolescent period, things related obviously to substance use in terms of exposure, but mood disorders and psychotic disorders depend on these other sets of brain processes going astray. And we can track this genetics of white matter development, those cortical, subcortical processes with modern brain imaging techniques and the extent to which they're heritable, but also the extent to which they're influenced by things like gender, your natural IQ, which is partially inherited, but SEI is socioeconomic status. The more and more we understand about these issues, the more and more we realise there's not just the genetics, but there is also those other sets of social influences that are taking place that really do matter in terms of the way the brain becomes eventually hardwired. Finally, I just want to deal with issues of other things that are out there in the world that we increasingly understand more. And one is the simple way in which the rotation of the planet actually affects our sleep-wake cycle and circadian systems, and the way in which our daily cycles are regulated, not only in terms of their physiology, like going to sleep and core body temperature, but our related behaviour and things like concentration, mood, and other sets of issues. So a lot of people, for example, are not aware of the extent to which their own mood actually changes during the course of the day, and that itself being underpinned by a circadian system. So like in my house, if you're rather grumpy early in the morning, that's actually kind of normal and actually improves during the course of the day. It's distorted in people with depressive disorders, but it changes throughout the day. There are good times of the day to go talk to a surgeon. There are good times of the day to go deal with your bank manager. You know, it turns out, as shown in a marvellous piece of Israeli research, there are bad times of the day, like just before lunch, to go deal with a judge who tends to be more precipitous in the decisions that they'll make. It's easy to criticise them. We often not aware ourselves the extent to which these key aspects of brain function are actually changing in association with something as simple as circadian systems, of which we now understand much more of the biology, but for time's sake I won't dwell. I'll try and make the slides move towards the end, rather unsuccessfully. And in context of that, there are really important functions. Like in the modern world, people have come to the assumption, like a Prime Minister or two back, you know, who thought that not sleeping was really important, that you could just work in the same way, that you could emotionally behave in the same way 24 hours in a robotic kind of way. It's not true. In fact, as you age, you don't necessarily need stacks less sleep. That's not true either. You actually need to regulate the system in terms of your mood, in terms of your behaviour, in terms of your physical activity, in association with the rotation of the planet, translating to about 7 to 8 hours sleep in most people most of the time. Finally, I just want to say a little bit about the social brain, which is one of the most important emerging areas of brain science. We now know not just about the fear bits, the amygdala-driven bits at the top of the hippocampus that we share so much with other animals. Now we know much more about the way in which social hormones associated traditionally with breastfeeding and childbirth like oxytocin, actually regulate the brain, and which parts of the brain, again in the frontal parts of the brain, actually regulate our social behaviour a great deal. And the extent to which there are systems, and now we can use really interesting things like inhaling oxytocin intranasally to change how you feel with people. You can actually feel quite nice about your spouse or other people, your boss probably even, just by squirting a little intranasal oxytocin. You know, the extent to which our behaviours actually do change as a consequence of what is happening. And that has implications in other areas of medicine, like in autism and sets of areas that we're involved in, just looking at the way people's facial the extent to which they lock on particular faces and change can be affected by something as simple as changing oxytocin levels. And we've been doing that increasingly as a therapeutic way of going forward. The really key issue then, I think, is as you start to understand brain function, your own brain function, some of the regulators of that function, I think you get a deeper appreciation of the extent to which emotionality is there, and learning to deal with it also involves learning to understand or needing to understand what are the basic processes that sit underneath it. Thanks.